How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? The answer may surprise you. Today on the Movie Theater Butter podcast, we're asking the big questions about Timothy Chalamet lookalike Bob Dylan and his career. The biopic, A Complete Unknown, was released like a few weeks ago, I think, at this point. And with me to speak truth to the man is my longtime friend, movie expert, Bob Dylan superfan, Luke Dzwonkowski. So, Luke, how are you, and what do movies mean to you?
I'm doing great. Wow, the cat's out of the bag. You call me a Dylan superfan right up front. That's a heavy moniker to live up to. What do movies mean to me? Movies are my air. They're my water. They're sustenance, man. Uh, what aren't movies? That's the question. Good luck getting an answer.
Damn, that was deep. That's my favorite quote, actually, right there.
Good. What do movies mean to you, Kim?
God, what are movies? You and I will have conversations about this until the end of time. I can't put this in like a single sentence. So why do I
Yeah,
demand that of you? I don't know.
let's put the
Movies are
movie
literally
aside.
my life. Yeah.
Yes, I know. No, please continue.
Oh, I don't know. Movies are my life. That's kind of it. That's the heart and the soul. And if anybody knows the first thing about me, that is it. That's sort of the first and last thing you ever need to know about me is I will love film forever and always in any way that I can, in any way that I can be involved. So
That's
that's what
great.
it is, man. And yeah, I definitely don't support this is like related but unrelated. I definitely don't support pirating movies online out of just your passion for watching movies. Definitely don't go watch movies online, even if you can't afford to watch movies. Like, definitely don't do that. I am gonna go see in the theaters The Count of Monte Cristo after we wrap this up, the new French version. I'm gonna go
Oh
see it
wow,
in the theater.
I haven't seen the other version. Is there an English version? A Spanish version? Is there how many
There's a
versions do we have here?
early 2000s. There was a American version, incredible, great movie, starring Guy Pearce and then other people.
Okay.
It was incredible. It still holds up. But there's a recent version that came out that was French made, which makes a lot more sense because it is a French written story and a French story. And I tried to go see it when I was at the Olympics this year. Didn't have the time, was kind of booked doing everything. And then I have tried to see it in theaters. I literally looked today. I have AMC A list. I looked today and I was like, I'm going to get a ticket. I'm going to finally go see it. Today was the last day that they're showing in my area. So I was like, oh, dang it. I'm going to go watch it in the theater and definitely not illegally online. So that's where that comment comes
Absolutely.
from.
Really enjoy all of your
Yeah.
casual name drops there, Kim. Oh, back when I was at the Olympics, I'm something of an AMC A-lister, but on the down low. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, we're going to drop a couple of names in this episode, most of them being Bob Dylan. So let's start off with our favorite quote from the film, or I will accept if you have a favorite lyric of Bob Dylan.
Oh, wow. Okay. I really, truly would not know where to start on that question. But I'll say I have three top quotes in the film. One is just a little throwaway line. He walks into a party and the guy says, Does music change anything, Bob? And he goes, It changes keys. You remember that line?
Hey. I don't
Great
remember
little
that line, but that's
throwaway.
funny.
Okay.
I love the little quips
But
that you have to slide into a movie to make it very, very like appeasing to wide audiences. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a real tentpole quote there. And then there's another, my number two would be when okay, sorry, there's two there. All right, so my number two would be when he, oh my God, I'm drawing a blank. Pause. Uh,
I love how
um,
no wait we do have to actually pause for a second. Not like really. I will continue to talk, but I have to
yeah,
interrupt you because
yeah,
I forgot to also introduce you as not only being a Bob Dylan superfan, but being a research superfan. Just that's how you are as a person, and that's one of the things I respect about you. So
yeah.
the way that we're even running this episode is I intentionally didn't look up a lot of things about Bob Dylan because I'm almost gonna like interview you about all these things and kind of fill in the blanks of, what I didn't necessarily get from the film or question about what I did get from the film. But that being said, please continue
Yeah.
your expertise.
That's beautiful. I have no idea what you're talking about, Kim. I only saw half of this film and nothing else about Bob Dylan. Uh,
Yeah, I spent
I
like
actually
10 weeks researching and reading 8 books.
Okay, I spent 3.5 weeks. I watched the film and I wept. Like Jesus, I wept. And then I was like, okay, I need to know more. I need to know what's going on here. What's the history behind this? I need as much context as I can get. So, of course, I'm also just holding my mic, so forgive the noise intrusions. So, I had to, of course, pick up the book the movie's based on. Great read. Actually, like a fantastic read. The guy's a good writer. You know who else is a good writer? A guy named Bobby D. Bob Dylan. This is
Oh, we
called
did an auto.
Chronicles. Yeah, I
Nice.
don't know if you can see this. Yeah, yeah, he did a. I mean, you could call it an autobiography, but it's Dylan, so it's also fantasy, and it's an epic, and it's sci-fi. No, it's not sci-fi, but it's many things. Okay, my second quote is when he's talking to Joan, and he goes, "Your songs are like oil paintings at a dentist's office."
I remember that. I do remember that one stuck out because it was like, is that supposed to be like a compliment or like not a compliment? It felt very neutral to me. I feel like if somebody told me that about my art, they were like, yeah, your art is like, your movies are like oil paintings at a dentist office. I would be like, so entertaining? Because like if I'm at maybe
Yeah,
this is just like my perspective. If I'm at a dentist office, I'm either like scrolling my phone, which I shouldn't be, or intentionally not scrolling my phone and looking around
yeah.
me. And if there's an oil painting, I'm going to be like, wow, well done. Couldn't have done that myself. So was that supposed to be like a diss? And I just
That's
it just
interesting.
didn't.
Because
Yeah,
when I'm in a
was
dentist
that?
office, I'm usually screaming in pain. So it's interesting that we have a different experience.
Mm,
But I think it's
fair.
supposed to be an insult. I think he's trying to say that like her music, her lyrics are so benign, so bland that they sound nice, but they don't have any substance to them, right? They're like
Mm,
a confectionery, whatever. Um,
yeah.
and I don't,
Actually,
she certainly
here's where we
doesn't.
get to the core of it. Before I know we're gonna kind of keep into because that's just how we talk. Uh, this is sort of the core of it. At the end of the day, I feel like Bob Dylan is one of the original hipsters. And you yourself being, I used to call you a hipster, but I think the culture has evolved in what we even define as hipster. And I think you have evolved as a person. So that's another conversation. But I do think Bob Dylan could be defined as the ultimate hipster. And that kind of illustrates it for me of him sort of being like, yeah, oil paintings, stupid. And I'm like, what do you,
That's good.
I love oil paintings.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a hipster. He's so many things. He's a trickster. Joan calls him the original vagabond in one of her songs. He's Woody Guthrie. He's the American flag. All right, now I'm just rambling.
Yeah, just rambling on.
Can I tell you my
That's a folk song thing. Yes, please tell me your second favorite quote or third favorite quote or whatever you were gonna go for.
Right. And this whole podcast should just be about our favorite quotes. My favorite one, though, is the heartbreaking quote he has. And I think it really is the most, like, maybe profound line in the film, where he just got punched in the face. He goes back to Sylvie's apartment. They've already broken up at this point, and he walks in, and she's putting ice on his face. And he says, everybody asks me how I write these songs. But when you look at their face, what they're really saying is, "How come I didn't come up with these songs?" Right? And that hit me. Anyway, what are
That's a
your
good
favorite
one.
quotes, Kim?
Well, so I only brought one because I usually keep this to the singular, not the plural. And as we've established, I'm consistently less researched than you, which is how we balance each other out. But my favorite quote that I chose was, I think this was said twice actually. This was said by the Johnny Cash character. He says, "Go track some mud on somebody's carpet," which the first time I heard it, I think it was through the letter that he sent to Bob. Um, and I was like, that's cool. That's rebellious. That's like fucking dope as hell, Johnny Cash. And then the second time I heard it, it kind of sunk in more that I was like, no, that's almost just like a metaphor for being just a shitty person. Because it's less of like, go track mud on the man's carpet. And it's more of like, go track mud on just anybody's fucking carpet. And it just felt like, I don't know, I'm reading too deeply into it, or maybe I'm not reading deeply into it enough because art is deep and depth. But it just felt like it was it it was a good way of, again, illustrating who Johnny Cash is, at least to pop culture, and by extension, a little bit of who Bob Dylan is to pop culture, in that sense of like, yeah, kind of rebellious, but not necessarily rebellious in the way that like we would want him to be, you know?
Yeah. And I'll say that quote the first time is verbatim what actually happened. That letter he writes Bob Dylan is word for word what he wrote in IRL. You'll learn that if you read Dylan Goes
Hell yeah.
Electric by Elijah Wald.
Amazing.
But
So you only
the
read 2 books.
only read two, and then I watched
Only.
4 or 5 or 6 or 7 documentaries. Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So that just leads us into talking about the whole thing. And I will start this off. I'm going to kind of just like overly generalize. I wasn't as impressed with this film as I wanted to be. And I think some of that is because I don't have the depth of the Bob Dylan knowledge. I came in very like, I know the basic songs, I have kind of a gist of who he is and like a hint of his career. And I will say also, there was a conversation you and I had years ago that I remember expanded a little bit about my Bob Dylan knowledge. And it was just, you were talking specifically about how he goes through these different phases vocally, and how like the that's kind of what I said. Just like the way that he sings, the vocal, the intonation, the sound itself changes over time. And I think you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, part of that also does have to deal with just him aging and smoking.
Yes. And there's also a theory that in his famous motorcycle crash, which is absent from this film, but any bobblehead, as I like to say, would any aficionado is going to know about the motorcycle crash of
Goddamn.
1966. But this is a big moment in his life. But some people say that the injury, which the extent of the injury is not well known, it's not really public information. Some say that it damaged his vocal cords or something because his voice does change after that time. But I also think, too, he is constantly reinventing himself. That's one of the things I probably admire most about him. And his voice does change. And I think it's always been an affectation. I don't think we ever really get his natural voice because he's a storyteller. He's trying to, he's putting on a performance to be more real than something that's real. Anyway, not to digress. We'll talk about that. But, you know,
Yeah. But no, I totally get that. And it's good to know, again, sort of the more notable parts of an artist's career. And it's interesting that this film was marketed towards our age range, our generation, because we're not really the generation who would know a lot about Bob Dylan, but I do feel like it was very heavily pressed upon our generation that like, go see this Bob Dylan biopic because Timothy Chalamet's in it. Which actually, let me get on that for a second. Fucking crushed it. Timothy Chalamet crushed it. I would argue almost as good as Taron Egerton in Rocket Man, which was so incredible. If you haven't seen it,
have not seen. I'm sorry.
that's okay.
But
You'll check it
I
out at some point. But he did fan fucking tastic, because it's like, it's one thing to be an incredible actor baseline, it's another thing entirely to be an incredible actor and impersonate such a well-known figure, and then it is a third incredible other thing to be able to do that again vocally. Like I can't even do like an accent. Well, I can't even do like a good British accent, which is the most basic thing for anybody to do. I can't even imagine just how much time and effort and talent goes into doing the kind of impression that he did, because it was fucking spot on. There were times where I was like, oh yeah, that's the guy. And then it was like, oh no, it's Timmy.
Absolutely. I know it feels like magic. I can only speak one language, and I would say I have only a working proficiency in English. But one cool thing about Timmy, and we have to talk more about him because I truly think we will never find a better actor to play Bob Dylan for like 100 reasons, but more on that later. But I just think he had like, I remember reading where he had 5 years to prepare for this role because COVID really threw off the timeline for them. And so there's some like cool behind the scenes shots of him on the set of Dune, and he's playing the guitar like in his trailer with the cast of Dune.
Sand
Like
getting inside, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, but he had a lot of time to prepare for this role, and I think it really shows. And I think this is the best, most accurate impression you'll ever get of Bob Dylan. Kate Blanchett does an incredible job in "I'm Not There," 2007
Kate
film.
Blanchett played Bob Dylan?
Oh yes, yeah.
Are you
So
being so serious right now?
yeah,
Oh
100%,
my
yeah,
god.
yeah. So the
That's
conceit of the
fucking
film,
incredible. Yeah.
it's great. So there are 6 or 7 actors who play Bob Dylan in that film, and they're all of like every gender, age. Like he starts as like a young black boy who escapes runs off on a boxcar train, and hitches his way out to New York, where he becomes Heath Ledger, and then Heath Ledger becomes Christian Bale. It's really
Nice.
fun.
That's
Uh,
cool.
it's trying to get at the idea again of this is a person who is constantly reinventing himself, and there is no definitive take on a guy who is so enshrouded in mystery, such an enigma to our understanding. So why even try? Let's just have a bunch of different people play him, right?
Damn, hell yeah. So I do want to kind of poke our conversation a little bit towards again, overall just how the film translates the real life story of Bob Dylan. And I know that it is technically based off the book as well. So I'm glad that you have not only the knowledge of Bob, but you have knowledge of the book that this was based off of. And actually, before I get into that, just another thing that I wanted to kind of like overarch this with the reason that I was a little bit less impressed with this than I wanted to be. I didn't dislike the movie. I did enjoy it. I will be honest, I almost fell asleep at one point, and part of that was because I was having a very sleepy day. I was exhausted. But part of that I think was folk music, and that kind of music is very comfortably pleasant to me. So I did also like I was a little bit sleepy naturally, and then I had this like beautiful music playing. And then what kind of like started to seal the deal was what is my overall critique of this film is that it didn't feel like there were a lot of powerful emotional moments. And I guess I'm not necessarily looking for like Bob Dylan walks in a bar and punches a guy in the face. The next day, tabloids all over him. I'm not necessarily looking for like that because I want it to be more true to him. But it did just not fully land with me again on some of the emotional ride roller coaster or like the emotional bits that needed to be there until sort of the third act when we get to that festival again. But yeah, and again, I kind of attribute that to I'm not sure if I know enough about Bob because I felt like there were times where the film was sort of asking me to fill in the blank, and I didn't have the answer to fill in the blank.
That is the question I wanted to ask you, because you should not need to know anything about Bob to enjoy this film. And so that I think you're right. I think your reaction is right, because I felt the same way, that they were jumping a little bit too much through his life. And I feel like so much of the film is dedicated to him singing the songs, which is great. I mean, I really loved that. But so much time is dedicated to that we don't get as much on the genesis of those ideas. We don't get him. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it is it's hard to film a guy sitting down at a typewriter for an extended amount of time, or sitting in the library or listening to a record, which is pretty much how he spent his days. So um, I can see why they had to jump to the next song, but I feel like it came a little bit out of nowhere, and and I think someone who is not steeped in the lore of the 1960s is not going to understand why moving away from folk is such a big deal. Maybe even the what was going on in the social movements of the time. Um, Maybe won't even understand. Okay, where even what's even going on in Greenwich Village? Like what is it like to be in New York City at this time, right? And all of that
Mm-hmm.
context feeds into understanding why he was such a significant figure. And so I agree. I think that the to some like my big hope with this film, as such a big Dylan guy myself, my big hope was that any person watching this film would come out going, I've got to listen to every song this guy's done. I want to learn everything about his life. I'm going to pick up his book Chronicles, uh,
Yeah.
available at your local retailer. All of that, but I ended up. I did like the film, but I do have some reservations. But I'm glad you said that you didn't really like connect with his the I don't know with the story as much, or like um, you didn't feel the emotional weight of the scenes. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, that was kind of it. That was kind of the gist, is that like I felt like I was getting there. I hate using this analogy right now, but I felt like I was a little bit emotionally edged for 2/3 of the film. Like they were like leading me and like, okay, so things are happening, and he's not really revealing himself to the world. He's not really revealing himself to, whoever he's dating at the time, and that's causing sort of these issues. But maybe that's just who he is. And they were like getting there, and then it was like, okay, and nothing pays off, and we're on to the next song. And he has a little bit of an on again, off again with Joan, but again, there just wasn't enough. I didn't feel moments where I was like, oh, that's a definitive moment in Bob Dylan's life that then leads to sort of the next thing, that then leads to sort of the next thing. I don't know.
Yeah. What was your like? What is your take on Bob Dylan prior to having seen this film? Like, how did you consider him as a human being?
Great question. So if you would have asked me before I saw this film, before I knew this was even coming out, I would have been like, I probably would have said that he's a folk singer because the number one song that comes to mind is Blowin' in the Wind. And I would likely classify that as folk because it feels in that world. So I would be like, yeah, he was a folk singer. I think he was around in the 60s. So probably like kind of anti war vibes, probably like hippie, probably like rolling with all those people. That would probably be the extent of everything that I knew about Bob. I don't think I even knew that he lived in New York, or like had, sunk that into my knowledge so deeply. And I also, I would have mentioned that I get him confused with some of the other similarly named artists. Who am I thinking of? We have Bob Dylan. We have, oh my God, there's another one. No, I get them confused all the time until this film came out. It's another Bob.
Bob
Fuck,
Seger?
there's another 60s Bob. Yeah, Bob Seger. And there was a movie about Bob Seger a year or two ago. Right? The guy who's like, I love Bob Seger and I love America. And yeah, right? Was that somebody
I don't know,
else? Was that a third
but
guy?
you know what? I don't really know much about Bob Seger, which is a bit of a dereliction of duty because he is a Michigander. We should both know more about Bob Seger.
Yeah. I should know more about Eminem. I don't know anything about him also. There's a lot of Michigan lore that just like went over my head as a kid. I think partially because everybody else seems to know so much about it that you almost get like a little bit discouraged to start to know about it because you're like, well, I'm never going to know enough about the next guy. And then they're going to start questioning me and I'm not going to know. I had that same thing with Star Wars. That's off topic. But I had that same thing with Star Wars before I got like really into Star Wars, where I was like hesitant to even care about those films because there was such an ingrained fandom that I was like, well, I'm never gonna, and I'm just gonna get shit on for not knowing these specific things. But to bring it back to Bob and to bring it back to that time, like this Bob, no, I really didn't know practically anything about Bob Dylan. I knew like the one song, I knew like two baseline pieces of information, and that's it. I knew nothing about Joan as well. I don't think I even knew her name until this film.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned about being afraid to be into Star Wars because it's such a a concentrated fandom. Bob Dylan is very much the same way, and I'm glad you're
Okay.
not a huge Bob Dylan fan because the only thing more insufferable than one guy talking about Bob Dylan is two Bob Dylan lovers talking about Bob Dylan. So I'm glad we're avoiding that scenario.
Yeah,
Um,
so we don't try and out Bob each other.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, we're bobbing for apples here. But yeah, I mean, if you want, I can give you some background on these people. I watched a documentary about Joan, actually, a really great documentary that came out last year. And she basically, like, it's just like an extended interview with her. It's like a 2 hour interview. And she just tells you her whole life story. And it's, if you liked this time, but you maybe weren't enraptured by Bob Dylan, Joan is very similar, and I think in many ways is well, she's an activist. Bob Dylan is. He tried to pivot his entire life towards just being an artist, and so if he was ever put on a mantle of activist, he would sort of reject that because he just
So
wanted to
that
focus
was
on his art.
okay. So that was kind of a core pillar of the film that I would kind of go back to my like I was very emotionally edged in that way of like leading up to that point where I could feel it, I could kind of sense it, where it was like, yeah, clearly he it doesn't feel as passionately about this activism as the people around him working in the same field and the same art as him. And of course, you get to that point with the festival, which is kind of the peak of it. But I still, kind of up until this conversation, I didn't really feel that. But now that we're talking about it, I'm happy that we are because that feels like a core pillar of Bob Dylan and his life and his career is that separation that you're talking about of the art and kind of the message, really.
Yeah, I mean, he begins well. It's a whole road we can walk down before we're called a man. But I mean, he essentially
Nice.
starts by doing folk and then gravitating towards a more electric sound over like his fourth and fifth album. And then, of course, the real gunshot that's heard around the world is Like a Rolling Stone, which kicks off his Highway 61 Revisited album. And that's what he plays at Newport in '65. And that's like, that's when he goes electric. And people say, like, you said you knew Blowing in the Wind. Did you know Like a Rolling Stone beforehand?
I've definitely heard it. I don't know if you would have played me that song, I probably wouldn't have placed it to Bob Dylan, but I would have been like, yeah, I've heard the song plenty of times on the radio and probably in films and stuff before too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like this very early, iconic, like rock and roll song. But yeah, I don't think I really associated it with Dylan until like 10 years after hearing it. It's just one of those, it's like always out there on the radio and stuff like that when you're a kid. I don't know.
That's what I got with Phil a lot with my guy Phil Collins, who I think you know that I have like a constant thing about Phil Collins. I don't really know how that all began, but there was a lot of growing up and knowing the songs before attaching them to the man. So I think that's kind of what were the building blocks of my personal fascination and love for Phil Collins. Is like you get to that point where you're like, oh my God, all of these songs that I know and love are by the same artist. Oh my God, wait, now there's all these other songs that I don't know that I love that are the same artist. But yeah, I mean, we also, again, going back to the Michigan of it all, we also get a lot of that when it comes to like, there's one radio station in Metro Detroit that is just constantly playing the same 87 classic rock songs. And they're amazing. And it's like one of the best radio stations of all time. But that feeds into, I'm sure there's plenty of people who can relate to this where they're like, yeah, I've heard that song so many times. I don't know who it is up until you have that one moment in your life where you're like, oh yeah, I looked up that artist and that's the song or similar. Let me go back and ask you really quick. We talk a little bit about some of the like the historical things that were going on at that time, how that plays into the activism of folk music specifically, and kind of just that group that Bob Dylan was a part of. I want to ask you a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis of it all. Was first of all, am I right? That was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, yeah, that's the scene where he's playing in the
Nice.
basement, and that's where Jones walking down the sidewalk, and everyone's panicking. People are trying to flee the city, get somewhere, and it's true. I mean, when that happened, basically, we discovered that the Soviet Union was trying to build nuclear weapons in Cuba, which is just like 150 miles from our shore, and so we sent a bunch of ships out to block them, and they had this standoff right outside of Cuba, and the whole country is watching this go down in real time, and it's just people are panicking all over. And there's this one great documentary I watched about Greenwich Village at the time, and they said, yeah, everyone around the country was panicking except the people in Greenwich Village who were just continuing to play music. People were having a good time. No one's packing up. No one's trying to get anywhere. They're just living in that moment.
I like that. It's
Yeah.
interesting though, because I was gonna ask when I saw that moment play in theaters. I was like, I don't know, man. Are we really that desensitized? Because if the same thing happened today, all of us are just gonna be on TikTok like, wow, this is crazy, isn't it? Reposting this funny meme about it. Whereas like they were showing it as, yeah, there were all these people around town that were super panicked about it. That were like, this is it. I'm gonna die if I don't just leave and go somewhere that maybe I won't die, and I don't know where that is anymore. But it was like, again, I was watching it in theaters. That was a good emotional moment because I felt the panic, and I felt so clearly the vibe between, you know, when she hears the song, what it means to her without saying the words, without having specific dialogue. There was a great emotional moment there. I will say I felt that was good. That was important. But just on the Cuban Missile Crisis of it all, it is crazy to me how they were presenting it as like, yeah, everyone's freaking out and everyone's running around and cars are crashing into each other and stuff. And I was like, damn, kids these days just don't panic anymore, because we wouldn't give a fuck. We'd be like, another thing.
That's a great point. I think probably the only thing that's like maybe similar to how the country responded is 9/11, where people had no idea what was going to be attacked next. And so in just about every city in the country, people were running out of skyscrapers. They were packing up. There was a run on gas.
We were running out of skyscrapers one by one.
No,
like, as in, like, what I mean is, like, we lost a skyscraper, we lost another one. Slowly but surely, we were going to run out of skyscrapers. That was a little bit of a 9/11 joke for you guys, and it didn't really hit because Luke is on a very serious wavelength, and I was on a very stupid wavelength. Please continue.
Yeah. Too soon.
9/11.
Too soon.
It's always too soon. Damn.
Yes,
oh my God, wait, this is so dumb. No, I need to interrupt you again. This is so dumb, and I'm going to cut this out because I can't put this online. But, like, if there was a 9/11 movie and then there was a second 9/11 movie and it was called, oh, no, it was funnier in my head. But I was like, it could be called, like, 9/11 Too Soon. But, like, 2, like the Roman numeral 2. And it could be, the poster could have the towers and it could. No, I'm stopping talking about this.
That's really
I'm going to cut this out. People died. It was very serious. Please tell me your thing and get us back on track.
Yeah, people love to make light of 9/11, Kim. That's good.
Yeah. People died. It was very sad.
All I was going to say is when he's performing during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that scene where Joan walks in, like, all of that is exactly how that happened, which is cool. In general, I'll say that this film is overwhelmingly accurate. They made a couple shortcuts, but none of them are a big deal. Like we talked about Johnny Cash. He was at Newport in 64, but he's actually not at Newport in 65, the folk festival. And so when he's there and he's like, track mud on the carpet, and then he drives into those two cars and drunkenly drives off.
That was
he wasn't
so
there.
Funny.
It's good. But the Elijah Wald, I just watched an interview with him where he said that one of his beefs with the film, overall, he really loved it, but one of his beefs was that he thought that Johnny Cash was too much of a caricature of himself, and that he was, in his words, he said that Johnny Cash was damaging to himself, but not to other people or other things. So he would not be recklessly driving and hitting those cars. And he actually really wanted to crack into the folk scene. So he was actually on his best behavior at Newport because he was one of the few people who saw the potential in folk to connect with the next generation. Anyway, I digress.
No, that's good to know, because I was going to point out at some point, you know, again, going on how I think Timothée Chalamet was an incredible casting choice. Monica Barbaro is an incredible casting choice. The person whose name I don't know who played Johnny Cash was an incredible... Like, the casting for this film all around, fantastic. So I did want to shout out specifically Yessi Ramirez, who was also the SVP of casting for Moonlight, Fire Island, The Menu, and many other great films. Casting is such an art, and it is so much of what the film becomes. And I just wanted to take that minute to shout out how incredible the casting was. And back on the Johnny Cash of it all, that's another artist that I know very little about. So it is good to have this moment of, like, you know how when you see a movie about someone you don't know, and even though you can, like, stop yourself from fully thinking everything is true, so much of it sinks in and you're like, yeah, that was definitely true. I saw it in the movie about them. So I'm glad we get to have this moment where I can be like, okay, that didn't happen. Probably wouldn't have happened, knowing more the context of Johnny Cash as a person as he was at that time.
Yeah. Johnny Cash definitely had alcohol and drug and other substance issues. But if you are interested in his life, I would recommend this same director, Jim Mangold. He also directed a film, Walk the Line, where Joaquin Phoenix plays Johnny Cash. And so I think part of the reason why uh, some parts of this film, A Complete Unknown, works so well is because Jim Mangold himself is just so passionately interested in the music scene of the 60s. He himself was born in 63. He's a New York City guy originally. But anyway,
Nice.
um, but yeah, so it's funny that he would make a movie about Johnny Cash and then a film about Bob Dylan, and they're both in each other's films. Like it's so clear what his interests are. And very
Yeah.
quickly, he tells a fun story where when he was making this film, he sat down with Bob Dylan like 5 or 6 times, each time for like 4 hours. And when they finally get to the end of the film, the end of the writing process for the film, he sits down with Bob, and they read the entire script, just him and Bob together. And Bob reads all of his own lines, and Jim reads everything else for the script. And at the end, Bob signs the script, hands it back to him, and goes, "Go with God."
That I do want to talk about because I heard about that, and I didn't fact check it. So again, I'm glad that we balance each other out, and like you have the intense research and the sources, and I can kind of fact check myself in real time. But I did want to ask you about that specifically because yes, Bob Dylan served as basically an executive producer of this film, and I heard and now had verified that he went through the whole script and kind of approved it, which is so interesting. And our this whole podcast is about adaptations. I want to talk about how there are times when having the original artist or the original author or whatever involved in that level of filmmaking is incredible and truly helps the film become all it can be. And there are times where I think it detracts. And I don't think, and it's a scale, right? There's no perfect answer. I think overall it is usually better when you do have the original source person involved. This is a time I think I guess I wonder. I'm going to ask you this question. I wonder, do you think that that was part of the issue that I had personally with it where I felt like some things needed more explanation, more emotional service?
I think I think it's more that the film, by choosing to focus so much on the moment that Dylan goes electric, by focusing so much on that, uh, what they ended up doing is building an entire story arc around this particular folk concert in 1965. But to the uninitiated, what does this moment really mean, right? And so I think there were more dramatic moments in his life. Like what was strange to me is this: the last scene of this film is him riding off on a motorcycle, and he's out in the woods, and it would have been exactly around the time when he actually crashed his motorcycle in real life. And so to me, it seemed odd. In the last 3 pages of this book, he talks about that motorcycle crash. So it seems like that's the natural ending to this story. And he also stops performing after the motorcycle crash. He stops touring for 8 years. He kind of becomes a recluse with his
Damn.
wife, um, and lives out in Woodstock, the same Woodstock that the famous concert was at. But he lives out there for a couple of years. But he continues writing, but he stops performing and kind of shuts himself away. So there's a very clear change in his life right after that motorcycle crash. It was the week after his album Blonde on Blonde released. That's when he crashed his bike. So I thought that's where the film was going to end, and then for some reason, they just cut the movie short like 30 seconds before we would see that scene. So I don't know. But I think in general, though, you're right though that like by focusing on, uh, I mean, trying to frame this around like folk versus Dylan, and he's slowly moving away from that. I just don't think in our modern world where we have like so many genres and there is no like beef between what's an authentic genre and what isn't. For someone who doesn't already like Dylan, I'm just not sure that they're going to connect to this film and really care or like I don't know. I think kind of like what you were saying. That was my concern after I watched it.
Totally valid. Clearly, I had a very similar concern. And yeah, I do also want to like just what's the word I'm thinking of? I do want to reiterate your point. Just tacking onto it, the whole concept that it's difficult for our generation to relate to this whole sense of like the genre war, because again, we live in a time and we kind of grew up in a time where there really wasn't that. I think we kind of saw the end of some of that. It was never like a big story in our lifetime. There was never like, hip hop artists say that pop is stupid. Like there's so much genre bending, and that's what makes music beautiful. And we grew up in a time where streaming became a thing, and so we were genre bending even more, to the extent that like I do want to mention my favorite band currently is Måneskin. They're a rock band, Italian rock band. They're fucking incredible. Go listen to them. You'll know at least one of their songs. And the lead singer, Damiano, has recently kind of embarked on some solo career. And so he's like doing his thing. And it's a change in genre from the rock. There's a lot of like, it's more pop, it's a little bit experimental. And there are, like, I've seen just like, there are some people who are kind of trying to make it a little bit of a genre war, be like, oh, do your old stuff, do your old rock stuff. But for the most part, there's just so many people who are like, oh, this is cool, new music, yay, love this. And so I really think that, again, goes to show how we live in a time where there's just not, at least when it deals with music, there's just not these genre wars that clearly were a bit more prevalent in like the 60s. What time do you think that they like ended? What time do you think was like the official, was it streaming that kind of like stopped that?
The genre wars between
Yeah.
in music. Well, I mean, I would say Bob Dylan is kind of the one who first. Well, okay, that's not fair because Elvis Presley took blues, he took folk music, he took rock and roll, um, uh, and there's like Elvis took these genres and he kind of blended them and he became this pop star and a big debate going on in the folk world at the time that Dylan comes into it is over how authentic folk is allowed to be. And some people say that, like, well, folk music is sort of this oral tradition. Nothing was written down. It's not about the songwriter. It's something that grew organically, right? It's a cowboy writing a song about his horse or about an outlaw in his town, right? It's not commercial music, right? And so when some city slicker comes along and takes a folk song from some rural, from the Mississippi Delta, it takes a Muddy Waters song and does his own city slicker version of it. It's like, well, is that a good thing because it gets that out there, or is it a bad thing because it's watering down the power of that song? It's not giving credit to the original author. Um, it's coming from someone who couldn't understand what the song is talking about, right? So there was a huge kind of raging debate going on in the folk scene, and Pete Seeger was sort of the mayor of the folk music world at the time. So he tried to play all sides at the same time. But yeah, he's an exceptional guy.
Relatable. Yeah, that is one thing I also did want to mention. There was some Pete Seeger. There was Pete, Pete Seeger slander in this movie. There was some Pete Seeger slander in A Complete Unknown. And I just need to set the record straight that Where Have All the Flowers Gone is an immaculate song. And I listen to it constantly. And I actually think it might have been on my top 10 this year for Spotify, maybe. But there was somebody in that movie was like, yeah, this song's stupid. Or something to that effect. And I just remember being like, excuse me? It's a beautiful song. Yeah.
I agree.
Pete Seeger. I want a whole film about him, which we kind of almost got. Like, we got a lot about him in this one. But I do think, like, let Edward Norton keep going with that. Give him, like, a full-on... Give him a mini-series, like a Netflix limited series. Ooh, I would watch that.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I do feel like the ideal way to tell the story of Bob Dylan is because he is such an evolving creature and his music defies boundaries and is always pushing into new directions and his story is larger than life. I do feel like he is sort of the perfect candidate for a mini series about his life. And I think that would fix some of the confusion that you were talking about, just as far as like how is he moving from one thing to the next in this story. But
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, Pete Seeger, he is uh, the okay. I do think that every work of art has like a main theme that it's trying to explore, right? To me, like my favorite example to use is The Social Network, where Aaron Sorkin is trying to tell a story about a kid who connects more friends than anybody in the world, and then at the end of the film, he has lost all of his friends and he resorts to having to use his own software to send a friend request. Right? That is the arc of Mark Zuckerberg. Of course, this is all before Facebook became this like misinformation fire hose. Right? The story would
Mm-hmm.
probably change if you made Social Network today. But at the time, that was the big angle that you could see to tell about that story. The big angle of this book that the film is based on is that Pete Seeger was the archetype, the king of the collective movement, and Bob Dylan was the king of the triumph of the individual, and they were constantly sort of at odds with each other. I mean, slowly over time, they developed a difference because Pete Seeger was a communist who believed that everyone had the right to perform any kind of folk songs. Folk songs were tragic, not just sentimental, but they could really get into the truth of things. And so he fell in love with them, and he wanted everyone to hear them. And Bob Dylan is constantly trying to avoid being boxed in and pinned down, and he wants to be exactly what he wants to be. And everyone's trying to tell him to be something, right? Joan's telling him to be the voice of the generation, to be this protest singer like she is. Sylvie is trying to tell him to join these activist groups and to be a voice for change that way. Pete Seeger is trying to tell him to play folk. People are trying to pin him into every single thing, and in the end, he just breaks out of that, right? And when he goes electric at Newport, he starts by saying he's not going to work on Maggie's farm no more. He's not going to be your farm animal.
Which was like, that was a good moment in the film, because you had a song that was very, again, very clearly different than the folk that you were expecting, as we know. And those lyrics just being like the same sentence over and over again was so funny. I was like, this is bad. And like, I'm sure if I listened to that song on its own, it's fine and it's good. But the juxtaposition, the moment that they put it in, the way that you set it up in the film, it was bad for a good reason, you know? Completely opposite of like when you watch the movie La La Land, love that movie, and you get to the point where you're supposed to be sensing that Ryan Gosling's character, it feels like a sellout. He's not doing jazz. He's not doing good music. And then we get that song Start a Fire by John Legend, which is not jazz, but is such a good fucking song because John Legend can't make a bad song. So you're watching La La Land and they're setting it up as like a home run of like, yeah, this is going to be shitty music and you'll really get it that like, this is why he doesn't like what he's doing right now. And then you get a great song and you're like, oh, I'm conflicted because I know what you want me to feel, but I don't feel it. Whereas going back to a complete unknown, you do get that sense of like, again, I'm sure that that song is good if I just listened to it on its own and like gave it the chance and gave it a moment. But they set it up so beautifully in the film to be disappointing as they wanted you to feel it was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do think there is power in repetition. I think I counted in Hey Jude how many times they say Jude, and I think it was 49 times. So it's not inherently a negative thing, but I will say your buddy Pete Seeger agrees with you. He talks about how it took him about 10 years to come around to actually liking Maggie's Farm, that song. He thought it just was a meaningless song. And he insists that part of the reason he was upset at Newport wasn't because he didn't like Dylan going electric. It said he just didn't think he was singing about anything, at least with that song. So, but in general, he didn't like the electric sound because he thought it was too aggressive and he thought it was destructive. And his whole thing was to bring people together. He talks about the contrast between playing folk music in a live venue It's people can sing along with you. You can have a conversation with the audience. It's this extremely like beautiful, intimate, collective thing. Just a person with their guitar or their banjo or their violin, and they're standing there talking to you, and you talk back to them. Whereas electric music is so overpowering that it becomes a performance. It's like a sport where there are spectators and then there are the people making the sound. And he didn't like that it disconnected those two groups.
You know what I think would, it maybe is too late. I'm not sure if Pete Seeger is still alive? Question mark.
He's not alive, unfortunately.
Ooh, rest in peace. If he was alive, I think he would enjoy moshing. I think he could get to the point where he realized that an electric genre of music has sort of come full circle and adapted to be not pushing on the audience. Well, maybe kind of pushing on the audience, but more interactive in that way. Because moshing, if you don't know, is interactive. It's a way to experience the music very physically, very viscerally. I moshed to Korn they came to Hollywood a few years ago before COVID. And yeah, that was a good time. But yeah, I think,
Mosh,
Pete Seeger, if he was still alive, could definitely mosh. And then he would be like, oh, I get it. It is still interactive, just in such a different way.
you
Have you never
moshed to
moshed?
corn, huh? I've never
Yeah.
moshed.
You gotta mosh.
That's
We'll get you to mosh.
moshing the corn sounds like a Thanksgiving recipe. You know, well, first you gotta
Exactly.
mosh the corn.
You gotta mosh the corn and then you gotta mush to corn. Yes. All at the same time. They actually do require you to bring your own cans because they will not supply the cans of creamed corn.
Mm.
And we're back. Technical difficulties because, Luke made not so kind comments about our latest oligarch, Mark Zuckerberg. And so we had a little bit of a technological issue that I think is directly related to that. So, we have so many things to talk about, and Luke, being the well-researched Bob superfan that we know and love, has way much more to talk about. But we do have to start to kind of like, end this story here. We have to just get to the end of the podcast because it's only like an hour-ish long, and I don't want to talk people's ears off. You and I can talk more, but we'll end the official podcast. One last thing I want to get into is less of something that I want to specifically get into. I want to ask you, what is sort of the one last thing that you want to bring to this conversation that you might want Bob fans or non-Bob fans to know about? What's something you can talk about?
Well, I would say in general, I really loved how they portrayed Joan in this story. I think Sylvie, who was based on Suze Rotolo, his actual girlfriend at the time, who for years I've been saying Susie Rotolo, so I've been saying both of her names wrong, but Suze Rotolo. I think they gave her a little bit of a short thrift in this film where she kind of she starts in a very powerful way as someone who is like getting him to go to protests, turning him into a little bit of an activist. She herself was this like very like progressive communist activist from a family that was all activists, and so I think she in the end just kind of becomes the uh, almost just a foil for Joan in a sense. She kind of becomes like used by the plot instead of her own independent part of the plot. Um, and then what's an interesting omission from this film is that you would not know this, but just a few months after the Newport Folk Festival, Dylan gets married and has a child, like all in a very short amount of time, to a woman
Oh,
named
damn.
Sarah. And she's not in this film at all, not even suggested or anything. So strange to sort of omit her from the story. She wasn't a singer, she wasn't an activist so much. She was just someone who, in Elijah Wald's words, was someone who was not trying to understand Bob or trying to pin him into something or trying to um, turn him into anything besides what he wanted to be. But she herself was sort of a force of nature. Yeah.
Can I ask what age was Bob in two things? What age was Bob when he was at the concert that was sort of the climactic scene of this film? And what age was Bob when he got married?
Yeah. So that's what's probably most interesting about like most unbelievable about Bob Dylan is that at this time, he was born in 1941. So the Newport Folk Festival of 65, he's about 24 years old when he goes electric. And at this point, he's already the voice of a generation. He's seen, and he talks about in his book, Chronicles, how he said, people will call me an icon or a star, and that's fine. You can sort of dismiss that. But when people start calling you a prophet or a messiah, that's when you start to run into trouble because people look to you for answers. And that's why that was part of the reason why he just wanted to move away from being seen as anything more than just who he was, just a guy, just a singer. So
Much
he
like
really
Paul
kind of,
Atreides. Not at all like Paul Atreides. Sorry, I
well,
just because of the Timmy.
no, but I mean, I think you're right though. And in fact, that's why I think Timmy is so fantastic for this film because his own career very much maps onto Bob Dylan's. I mean, he's a New York City kid who shoots up into stardom. I watched an interview with him where he said he filmed 4 movies in 6 months, and one of them was Interstellar, and then A Beautiful Boy, and some other ones. They all were back to back, and all of them were shot before anything actually got out to the public. And so all of a sudden, one movie after another is coming out with him, and he became famous like overnight, essentially. And so the whole time he was making those 4 films, he was a nobody, and he loved that because he could really sink into it and everything. And then all of them come out, and it just changes his whole life, right? But I think if anyone could understand what Bob Dylan's going through, it would be a guy like Timmy. And for him to be also the most talented actor of his generation is just like, that's why this movie is lightning in a bottle in some sense. Not just that, but Ed Norton as Pete Seeger. I mean, everyone is just perfect in this thing.
100%. Yeah. I would talk about that forever and ever because truly, yeah, every single one of those actors were perfectly casted and just incredibly talented and driven to make their roles as. I hate using perfect when it comes to art, but I will say it anyways. But they really did make those roles perfect. So 10 out of 10 on all casting and all of the acting fronts. I already forgot what I was going to say. There was something that I was going to say about Bob Dylan being a complete unknown, completely Bob and Dylan. And I think the more that I say words, the more that I'm getting completely lost on what I was going to say. I will take it back, though. I asked what age he was. It's interesting that he was, you said 24 during the festival. That's kind of mind-blowing because we've been talking a lot about, well, you've been talking a lot about, and I've been absorbing a lot about how so much of his career and who he is defined by not being defined, and by being sort of this, he is able to try and take away like this character of himself as much as possible, which is, I don't know if I'm saying these words right. When you are a star, as Bob Dylan is and was a star, there is an image sort of placed on you by the public of like who you are. And it will never fully define you because human beings are confusing and weird and we constantly change and unchange. But Bob Dylan being sort of defined by being undefined and being able to only define himself and redefine himself, as we've been talking about, is very interesting. And it does remind me of just like how a lot of us are in like early 20s, but really like the 18 to 23 range. And maybe this is just me, but I feel like there was a lot of, that is kind of when you start to find yourself and start to make yourself and start to be like, okay, who the fuck am I? And does it matter? And can I just change tomorrow? And all of that. So it is interesting that he's kind of at the tail end of that, because I do feel like roughly by the mid 20s, most people kind of lock into who they feel they are at that time. Does that make sense?
Yes. My all-time favorite Bob Dylan quote is him saying, life isn't about finding yourself or finding anything. Life is about creating yourself.
Hell yeah. And this is the perfect time to segue us into our trivia section and officially cut you off because I know you have so much more to bring to the conversation. I know you have depths and depths of research. You have like
Yes.
a 10-page something in front of you that you're scrolling through right now because this is who you are and this is
No,
incredible. How many pages?
that's not true. Kim, I have no notes. I I wanted
No
to,
notes. Okay.
yeah, I thought about, I had so many notes last time we recorded for Oppenheimer and Sleepy Hollow, whatever we did in the past. I had so many notes, but I wanted to mix it up this time. So I guess to quote Bob Dylan, I would say I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now.
Oh, hell yeah. Ooh, do we think that that was partially the inspiration for Miley Cyrus, her single Younger Now? I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Uh,
Huh.
Not very familiar. Can you sing it for us?
Yeah, I'll sing it. Uh, Look at that. We cut out the moment where I definitely did sing that song for you and we recognized it and we talked in depth about it. And we moved on to segue over to our movie theater butter pop quiz because you have, again, such a depth of knowledge when it comes to many things, but specifically Bob Dylan. So I have brought to you two very difficult, very deep dive, and completely fact checked questions. Luke Dzwonkowski, are you ready
I'm
for our
ready.
movie theater butter pop quiz?
Let's hear it.
All right. There are two questions. Question number one: how tall is Bob Dylan?
Man, I'm gonna guess 5'7".
Oh my God, you are right on the money. He is. There are many sources that say he's 5'6.5", many that say he's 5'7". So either way, yeah, Bob Dylan,
Wow.
which is ever so slightly shorter than Napoleon. Napoleon was 5'8", I believe. Anyways,
Oh yes.
question number two.
Let's hear it. Give it to me.
This one's really hard. I mean, I know that I hyped it up as like the first one was going to be kind of tough and everything, but like this one, I was going to allow you to have your notes because normally you do take notes like we just talked about. And I was like, this one's going to be an open book. But you don't have the book. So, question number two:
Yes.
in what year was Blowin' in the Wind released?
Uh, well, he lands like he flew or took a ship. He arrives in New York City in January of 1961. He starts performing around at the basket houses where you would just ask for cash. And he doesn't come out with his first album until the end of 1961, I believe November. And Blowing in the Wind isn't on his first album, it's on his second album. His second album, which is my personal favorite, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, I believe that comes out in 1962. So that's going to be my answer, is 1962. I guess it could be late 61, early 63. No, I'm going to go 62.
62, final answer?
Yeah.
Okay, so I will 100% fact check myself. I did go through and I did find several sources that said this same number. But, you know, the internet these days, kind of crazy, kind of a big flaming hose of misinformation, as we've said earlier. But the answer that I got through my sources was 1963.
Wow. Okay. Maybe I don't know anything about this guy. I'm having second thoughts.
Yeah.
What's his
You
name?
don't even, what's
Robert?
his middle name? What's his middle name?
Well,
You
his
don't
legal
even know.
name is Robert Allen Zimmerman. That's his actual legal name.
Damn, I didn't know that. So many people with Allen as the middle name. Tim Allen.
Is that his middle
That's
name?
one. Steven Spielberg. Steven Allen Spielberg.
Wait, so Tim Allen's name is Tim Allen Allen?
I swear to God, it's Tim Allen something else. And he did
Huh.
what white girls do nowadays, which is take the middle name as the last name.
I see.
I think
Okay.
so. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. I need to be more well researched when I do these podcasts. But disclaimer, everything I've ever said is wrong. 1963 is the answer that I got for when Blown in the Wind was released. And now we are
Okay.
on to truly our final question of the pod. Luke, how do you think this film is best watched?
You know, uh, it must. I'm still thinking about that second question, and it must have come out on the times they are changing. It's not in Freewheelin', okay, because that's his third album. But anyway, we're all learning so much here as a group, as a family. Um, Uh, okay, what was that last question again?
No, no, I love it. How do you think this film is best watched?
Oh, yes. Okay. I gave this some thought and I really bounced around a few ideas, but I think if you are willing to go, spare no expense, you should watch this first thing in the morning in Greenwich Village, New York City, and whatever house you can find it at, wherever playing. And when you walk out, I want you to take in all the live music that you're hearing while you're there in Greenwich Village. It has to be in the morning because you got to have a full day ahead of you after you watch this. And I want you to take that energy, that momentum that you get from how inspiring Bob Dylan is as a poet, as a prophet, as a musician. One of my favorite lines in that book, Dylan Goes Electric, is he says, "Well, here's the thing about Dylan: is he wasn't a musician. He wasn't just a musician. He wasn't just a poet. He wasn't certainly not just an entertainer. He was the zeitgeist." And he calls him the
Mm.
ghost spirit, I think, of the 1960s, of the folk movement. The
Fan of the
ghost
opera, fan of
spirit.
the folk movement. I
Yes.
like that.
That's the only way you can properly understand Bob Dylan is that he has always been a larger than life figure. I don't know. I'm not explaining it very well.
No, you are. I get it. The words make sense. The words are in a sentence that makes sense and translate meaning. I also love that this whole time viewers will know because they've seen you, but our audio only listeners will not know that Luke has been occasionally sipping from a glass of a gentle white wine this whole time, just at the poignant little moments of this conversation.
I would say it was gentle, but this is actually leftover. This is my champagne, my prosecco from New Year's Eve,
Oh,
but it's
you
leftover.
could make a Negroni Spagliato with
Yes, I
Prosecco
could.
in it. Are
Don't
you
buy a
familiar with
bottle.
that reference? Are you as chronically online as I am? The
I'm not.
Negroni Spagliato?
No, I don't know what that is. Can you explain?
Okay. Yes, I actually do need, because this is an important thing to know if you are a human being with a soul and a heart. Um, Emma D'Arcy, I believe that's how you pronounce their last name, the actor who plays Rhaenyra in House of the Dragon. They were in an interview alongside, oh my gosh, I'm going to forget the other actress's name, but she's incredible. The actress who plays Alicent in House of the Dragon. And they were just talking, and it was just a very casual, normal interview, actor on actor, talking about stuff. One of the question was, one of the questions was, what is your drink of choice? And Emma's response was to say, a Negroni Spagliato with Prosecco in it. Very just like jokingly flirtatious, as you know, people have interactions like this. And for some reason it was just so perfectly set. It was just one of those things that, like, for no reason at all, but for every reason at all, it just became the meme of the moment. So it was, the drink of choice for so many people was a Negroni Spagliato with Prosecco in it, which apparently a Negroni Spagliato already has Prosecco in it. That's what makes it Spagliato, but it was just like the icing on the cake of that little meme that it was like the rule of threes. So that is where that comes from.
That's great. That drink sounds very demure. Am I using that
Very
reference right?
mindful.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
mindful.
Look at that. Look at that. 45 years old and still strong on the references.
Hey, 40 going on 45. Okay, buddy.
40 going to 45. No, just for the internet to know, this is not a 45-year-old man. I just joke because he's like 5 seconds older than me. And so you're legally obligated. If you have a friend who's older than you, you're legally obligated to make jokes at their expense, especially when you're in like the 30 range.
I'll have you know I'm on East Coast time, Kim, so that puts me 3 hours and 5 seconds ahead of you. Thank you very much.
Oh, damn. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you're slightly, oh no, so you're slightly more older than me then.
yeah, that's
I'm
right.
even, I'm even less young, more young.
That makes me your
Yeah.
elder.
True. Well, you've got like the wizard aura, so that tracks. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I decided not to. This is going to be great for the audio only listeners, but I decided not to shave after I started reading about Bob Dylan. So this is how long I've been trying to read about Bob
Good.
Dylan
Is your
for.
hair longer than mine?
That's very possible.
Damn.
I'd say it's
Wow. Okay.
what would you say that is? That's about a third of a Bob Dylan, maybe.
Yeah, his
One,
hair, incredible,
yeah, he's got good
incredible.
hair, man.
Everything about him. So let's tie this up. The last like real, this is not really a real question. This is more just the offhanded question of if you have social media online that is public that you want the internet to know about, where can the people find you? And if you are not so inclined to share any sort of social media, Letterboxd is something I also usually recommend to people because that's something people are a little bit more comfortable tossing out there. But where can the people find you?
That's great. Well, my social security number is so
Yeah.
get it. That was pretty good, right? So okay, yeah, you can find me on TikTok. I say as they're about to ban it before this video even goes out. But
Good.
did you see? By the way, I don't know if you saw this. Bob Dylan joined TikTok like today. He
Did he
joined
really?
TikTok
Of
today.
course. Oh my
So that
God.
the headlines were like Bob Dylan joins TikTok 4 days before it's about to be banned. Really fun. That's exactly the Bob Dylan I know and love. That's great. He's still got it, man.
I
He's
respect that.
83. I saw
He's
him in concert.
83?
Yes, and okay, and Joni Mitchell, boy, Joan Baez, she is 4 months younger than him. So, but she retired. She did her last concert in 2023. She did a little tour. That's what that documentary is about that I watched. Great documentary if you are interested in her life. But but yes, Bob Dylan's 83. He has been basically on a nonstop concert since 1988. He has not really taken a year
Dang.
off except when COVID hit. So okay, just to give you a sense of how much music this guy has made, I looked this
Yeah.
up. A prolific writer of our time is Taylor Swift, and she's written about the number I saw was 250 songs. That comes from 11 albums. That's incredible, right? Granted, she's only been doing this for like, I don't know, 15 years or something. But Bob Dylan has written 600 songs, and that's come out on 60
Jesus.
albums. He's come out with 60 albums. And so, when you say like, oh yeah, what's your favorite song? It's like, well, how do you pick between your 600 children? It's like it's like an impossible
Yeah,
question.
really. And it'll
But
change
okay,
every time. It's like asking the question, what's your favorite movie? Some people can kind of stick to one and can be like, yes, I'll call this my favorite. This defines me, whatever. But I think a lot of us have really gotten to the phase of understanding that you can't have just one favorite movie, and they changed. And a format online that knows that is Letterboxd, which leads us back to the question of where can the people find you if they so desire?
yes, thank you. I would say Letterbox is where I'm going to be like the most fun. My name on there is just my name, so it's just Luke Dzwonkowski at Luke Dzwonkowski. I think they use at on Letterbox. Good
Yeah.
luck
Can
spelling
you
that though.
for the yeah, I was gonna say for the audio
Yeah,
listeners, would you spell that out? Because
sure.
it's kind of funky.
So it's Luke.
Yeah. I could you spell out that second part for us, please?
Oh yeah, sure. So it's D as in David, Z as in zebra, WON as in Nancy, KOWSKI. I'm on there. I try and log every film I watch. I think I just hit like 1,500 or something, so I had a little internal party going
Nice.
on. But I also spent about a month of my life. This was back in 2020, peak pandemic, where I created as many lists as I could think of that I would possibly be interested in on Letterboxd. So it's like best comedies, best high school movies, best college movies, best Christmas movies, all kinds of things. I spent like a month compiling all these lists. So if you're ever looking for like a recommendation, stop on by. The water's warm. Let me know what you think.
And I will say there are many people I know who have excellent lists. And because all of these people are my friends, I could never choose one person that has the best lists. But if I had to, there was a gun to my head, and you said, I will kill you with this gun if you do not tell me who of your friend group has the best lists. Just in general, not even movies. Yeah, I'm going to say it. It would be Luke Dzwonkowski. Incredible list
Kim,
making, truly.
thank you, Kim. That means a lot to me.
I remember because there were several times, I think, where you made just like really in depth lists in college and disperse them around the groups of like, I think you did one that was sort of a genre, sort of like the best of, and you cross-reference between like all of these different websites. Like, again, a very well-researched person, and also just incredible when it comes to lists. So if you like good lists, if you just want a bunch of new movies in your life, go check out Luke Dzwonkowski at Letterboxd.
Thank you. I clearly I don't got a lot going on, so if you want to hang out, let's talk about movies.
Hell yeah. And we will talk about several more movies as they come out, because we have so many more. We've talked about a few, and some of those episodes have gotten lost. This episode will not get lost. I swear to God, somehow, some way, this episode will get edited and turned around, and it will come out very soon. So thank you. Thank you, as always, for being on this podcast. Thank you for being who you are. Thank you for being alive. Thank you for this episode specifically.
Likewise, Kim. Always so happy to be here. Truly, how fun is this? We get to talk about Bob Dylan for an hour. Like, how many people do you get a chance to do that with?
Yeah. We get to just talk about, I love to, again, this podcast being a forum to talk about films, but specifically to talk about the adaptation of it all, like where things come from and how that translates to the screen. Because again, there's no one perfect formula for an adaptation, for adapting a story to the big screen. It's so interesting to see how people choose what they choose to make the film about this thing. And again, you learn so much more too, because you watch the movie alone and you're like, oh, cool, I know things about Bob Dylan and I know some more stuff. But the more that you dive into like, okay, where did this all come from? It's just fun. It's just fascinating. You get so much more of an enhanced world around the story.
Yes, and I know we're already like short on time, but as a final thought here, I do think if you are trying to understand the world that we are living in right now, there is no better way to understand it than to understand the 1960s. That was the decade of change, the decade of revolution in many ways. And if you can learn from that time and apply it to this time, I think things will start to make more sense. And man, it was just so exciting. Like, I don't know, we're kind of living in the 60s all over again. And that's one thing I could talk about forever, of course. But
we could. And you and I will have more conversations about this, because I think I've talked to you about how the Vietnam War in specific is my favorite war to learn about for many reasons. And I was talking about, I think I was talking to you about this or somebody recently, where it's like, yeah, it's kind of crazy when you grow up and you sort of idolize these revolutionary movements in history, and then you live in, now you got to do the revolutionary movement. And you're like, couldn't I just sit here and everything's perfect and peaceful and I can just think about history and I don't have to now do the thing? Because that's heavy. That's a time.
Yes. Yeah, we're cursed to live in interesting times, as someone said. One of my favorite quotes and this is like one of my favorite life quotes, and it just so happens to come from someone who's in this story. But long before I ever knew who Joan Baez was, she once said that action is the antidote to despair. And I think about that quote like once a week. If you ever, and I think that also is extremely informative as we go into this next Trump administration. If you ever feel like just giving up, checking out, tossing your hands, ridding yourself of this mess of a country that we're in right now, just remember, action is the antidote to despair. Get involved, not just vote, but get out there, get out in the community, volunteer, talk to people face to face. You'll feel a lot better, according to Joan.
Absolutely agree. And if Los Angeles is any indication of our ability to do that, within the response to these wildfires, not that I don't. It's so tough, but just to reiterate your point as well, I mean, the whole city, we just kicked into action like no other. At the time that we most needed to do something, we showed the fuck up. And so I think that also lends itself to what you're talking about with action is the antidote to sadness. Is, even in the most tragic. Another quote, okay? I'm gonna land this off with another quote. I think you know where I'm going with this. one of my most favorite wizards of all time said something along the lines of, I'm going to get it wrong now because the pressure's on. He said, damn it, help me with this right now. Isn't it like even in the darkest of times, there's always turn on the light?
Oh, yeah. Well, I thought you were going to say Gandalf's time, or Gandalf's quote where he says, so do all who live to see such times, but that's not for them to decide. All that's left to do is to decide what to do with the time that is given to you. But that's Gandalf.
That
You're thinking of
works.
Dumbledore, where he says,
Yes, and I
even
just Googled it. You got it? Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, even in the darkest of times. And this is in Prisoner of Azkaban, directed by Alfonso Cuarón, great director. Even in the darkest of times, one must remember, and he swooshes his hand over to turn on the light, right? Something like that.
Damn right.
Yeah.
Damn right. Hell yeah. And on that note, once again, thank you, Luke. That's the episode. We talked about Bob and many other things.
We did it. Please find me on Letterboxd or MySpace, and we'll talk about Bob Dylan.
Hell yeah. Well, it sounds like that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to Movie Theater Butter, a Tilkin Productions podcast. Make sure to follow us where you're listening and on our Instagram page at the Movie Theater Butter podcast. And hey, it couldn't hurt if you gave us a quick 5-star rating on this platform. All right, I'm done. See you next episode.